All right, now it's my privilege to give the final talk of the meeting here before we wrap things up. So what I'm going to do is just give a really brief overview of our findings from the NTRAP project, and as they relate to VTE, at least from the panel that we worked on looking at the acute resuscitation panel. So we'll go through some of the initial slides a little quickly, as we've talked about NTRAP in general already, but I really want us to focus in on the questions that we have identified, and I think this is going to be good to lead us into the breakout sessions later today and give us a little food for thought. I have no disclosures. And just acknowledge we've already acknowledged the NIH for funding this conference, but want to again recognize the Army Medical Research for supporting the NTRAP project. So as we all know, in 2016, the NASM Report put forth a call for a National Trauma Research Action Plan. Part of the idea of this plan was to not only help us identify where we should go forward with trauma research, but also, as we just saw in our last panel session, to try to advocate for funding in the specific areas that we as the content level experts have decided are the highest priority topics. And just a specific text from that NASM report recommendation under number 7, to strengthen trauma research and ensure resources available that are commensurate with the importance of injury, we should establish a National Trauma Research Action Plan. And so with those marching orders, we moved forward. And, you know, there was a first attempt at this, which was done by an expert panel who convened and basically came up with their ideas for what should be some specific research areas. And you'll see within that, going back, DVT prophylaxis and VTE prophylaxis in general was listed as one of the high priority topics. And you won't be surprised to find the usual subjects there, which include optimal strategies for VTE prophylaxis. How should we use oral anti-10A inhibitors? What's the duration of VTE prophylaxis post-discharge? And this is, again, a 2016 paper, and goes on from there. Again, this was done by a group of experts and was sort of the first foray into looking at a sort of consolidated goals for trauma research. But under the leadership of Dr. Bulger, we proceeded with a more formalized National Trauma Research Action Plan, which had multiple aims. We've talked about these here already, but I will speak specifically about aim 1 here, which is to perform a gap analysis of both military and civilian trauma research in order to identify priorities across the continuum of care. There was a steering committee that was convened under the leadership of Dr. Bulger, where leaders from not just trauma surgery, but from our subspecialty partners as well gathered to talk about how we would attack this sort of large problem of not only looking at, you know, our specific areas, but really across the entire spectrum of care. How are we going to identify those research gaps? And it's important to note that we weren't speaking to ourselves as trauma surgeons in a vacuum here, and that was not our approach. Specialty societies were engaged from, again, across the spectrum of care, from the pre-hospital all the way through into the rehabilitation areas, and of course all of our subspecialty partners. And for this process, again, we wanted to be sort of as rigorous as possible, so we utilized the Delphi Method, which is a consensus technique that provides a systematic method of collecting and aggregating questions from experts via an iterative process where there's multiple rounds where the panelists have feedback, and I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that as it relates to our panel. But this allows, I think, at least initially, an unbiased collection of research questions, and then the ability of the experts to go through in multiple rounds to decide, well, are those low, medium, or high priority? And if they're high priority, you know, where on the spectrum do they fall? So in total, there were 11 Delphi panel areas, so 11 different panels that were convened to tackle this question. And I had the honor and really the pleasure of leading the acute resuscitation evaluation and imaging panel. And as you see there, you can look, again, this included not only trauma, but burn, orthopedics across the spectrum of care. And I'll say and part of our initial meeting of the steering committee and the panelists was to sort of identify how we would approach this, what our topic area would be. And I would say that my topic area became acute resuscitation, evaluation, imaging, ... because we realized that there wasn't really a panel that tackled the entire inpatient hospital management. So how are you going to manage specific injuries? How are you going to, what are you going to do with the patient after you resuscitate them in the trauma bay and identify their injuries? And so this really became an interesting and a big panel, as you will see here in a moment, and a lot of fun to tackle. Just to say that this has been extraordinarily productive group, and the papers are already out and are continue to come out in various forms. I believe 10 of the 11 papers are completed. You can see the first one out was our burn research gap Delphi survey. We've had the neurotrauma one published. All these have been published in Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery, and we thank the journal for their partnership with that. 2 recent publications, which are out in EPUB format, which is the geriatric research gap, which was led by Bilal Joseph, and the pediatric research gap as well. I'm pleased to report that our panel has also published this as well, which is the acute resuscitation, initial evaluation, imaging, and added management research gap to try to better incorporate all of the issues that we are tackling. So this is just a brief look at our panel. So we had a panel started with a panel of around 50 people, and just want to show you this to show, again, this is not just trauma surgeons. We had, emergency medicine participants, radiology participants, and try to get a broad look. We had included, of course, people with military service as well, in order to tackle that goal of getting both military and civilian research goals incorporated into this panel. And this is just to show the Delphi rounds. And so again, just really briefly to take you through the process, the panelists were given some reading and some background, which again was a little difficult with such a wide panel, but allowed the panelists to generate research questions. And we asked them to give us those questions in a PICO format to have some structure. As you'll see, unfortunately, many of them are not in the PICO format, but that's okay. And we really generated this incredibly long list of research questions. Once those research questions were obtained, they went into a computer program, and the panelists would go in and basically rate where they thought that question, what the priority level of that question is on a Likert scale from 1 to 9. And then, through that rounds, you would continue through multiple rounds of the Delphi process to answer those questions until consensus was reached. So once 60% consensus was reached, that question was answered and it was removed. So luckily, where we started with 1,000 questions, as we gained consensus on questions, that number decreased and allowed us to get to our final results. So we only found 992 questions that reached consensus in this panel, which is a lot of questions. About a third of them were high priority. Again, this was through multiple rounds of reviewing those questions and ranking them on the scale. We had a good bulk of 62% or so were medium priority questions and very few low priority questions. I mean, I think that just tells you the questions we generated were real questions. They were good questions that have not been answered and affect the care of our patients. And really very few of them were low priority questions. And so the next question we had to tackle was, how do we categorize 1,000 questions in this panel and all the questions in the other panels to sort of be able to categorize them or make sense of them, right? Because we're not going to just publish a paper of 1,000 questions and say, go read it, good luck. So Dr. Bulger, Dr. Price, the steering committee came up with the idea of developing a taxonomy to basically categorize the questions in multiple different areas based on what kind of intervention it was, what the specific disease process it was, what kind of research it was entailing, basic, translational, clinical, those sorts of things. This is a little hard to read, at least with my current eyesight, but this is just one example of the taxonomy, just looking at interventions. So was it a pharmaceutical intervention, a fluid and blood product intervention, an operative intervention? And so each question would be labeled under multiple different taxonomies, and we actually had multiple reviewers place them in that taxonomy to try to get some reliability within how we are relating things. This just gives you a little idea, though, of what were the interventions that got the most interest. The dark bars are the high priority questions. On the right side, you're seeing sort of proportions. So the gray bars are medium priority, the dark bars are high priority. So you can see pharmaceutical interventions scored very high, as did fluid and blood product resuscitation. If you go down to some of the other questions, there's more moderate priority questions, and you can see going down from there. I think the real benefit of this is going to be when we combine the data from all of the different panels together. And we'll talk a little bit about that, obviously, as it relates to VTE, but there's not going to be just VTE-related questions in my panel. They're going to be in the neurotrauma panel. They might be in the burn research panel. They might be in the geriatrics panel, and it'll be nice to characterize those things as we go forward. We also had these observable clinical states, and this is where we actually kind of characterized what the question was about. It might be about mortality, coagulopathy. We actually had a specific VTE-related topic there, and you can see that we had 11 high-priority questions that were specifically labeled as VTE, that were high priority, and many more that were listed as medium priority questions. So knowing that we have this 900 and some question panel that basically encompasses the care of trauma patients from the minute they hit the door in the trauma bay till the minute they leave the hospital, where do you think VTE fared in the sort of priority list of those questions? We not only had high priority, but we actually had them ranked. The answer is they fared very well. So these are the top 10 research questions based on priority that were generated by our panel. How many of them related to DVT? The number 3, 5, 6, and 7 questions. So obviously these are important questions that are recognized again through this Delphi panel of multidisciplinary experts. And you can see some of the questions there, and we'll go into the specific questions here in a little bit more detail. And some of these are actually multiple questions built into one. You'll see some run-ons here. But, the number 3 ranked question, what's the optimal timing, agent, dose, and risk of intracranial hemorrhage? So getting to the TBI VTE prophylaxis question that we discussed with Dr. Beaumont yesterday. The number 5 ranked question, does early prophylaxis in spine surgery? And trying to tackle that question that I know we all struggle with on a regular basis. The number 6 question, in adult trauma patients, what's the risk of VTE in patients who get TXA? This is a great question, right? That we're interested in answering. Number 7, here's a theme we've been talking about a lot. On discharge, in trauma patients that aren't fully ambulatory, how long should they be anticoagulated? What's the optimal agent? Should it be Lovenox? What about aspirin? So again, all the things that we've talked about today are relevant. And then again, question number 14 is sort of another take on the TBI question with a little bit of a more nuanced approach. So again, we're looking at within the top few questions, we've got a lot of VTE-related research involved here. Just to give you a little idea of some of the other questions, what do we do as far as dosing regimens as they relate to the obese? Number 128 was given the high variability in coagulation as it relates to genetic and phenotypic profiles. Is there anything that we should do with VTE prophylaxis to sort of individualize how we prophylaxis people based on maybe their propensity to either clot or not? A tie was, what are the risk factors of early VTE, and maybe gets a little bit to the PT question and Dr. Knudsen's idea of maybe we shouldn't call it VTE anymore, but these are different entities. But I think, we're recognizing more and more that people are walking in the door with these problems, and why does that happen, and how can we mitigate that risk? And also back to the issue of VTE as a quality metric. What can we do about a patient who comes in, with a VTE and gets diagnosed earlier on? And then again, looking at biomarkers in question 171, we had some medium priority questions. If you give a patient PCC for reversal, what's their VTE rate? Question 293, back to the discharge, what's compliance with outpatient VTE prophylaxis? Does it work? Will patients take it? What should we give them? And then what's the duration and frequency of clinically significant PE after discharge? So again, gets to the idea of we only really know what happens our patients from a VTE standpoint to a certain extent while they're in the hospital. But we send people out who aren't ambulatory, who are still in a sort of a altered inflammatory state, and what happens to those folks there. So again, those are the specific research questions. But you can see as we've organized our breakout sessions for today, they actually fall very nicely into those sort of categories. So I hope as you consider in these different broad areas, not only your own questions that I'm sure you have and that you'll generate today in your discussions, and for those that are joining us by Zoom, as you consider how to advance VTE research in your centers or in multi-center studies, use this document, the NTRAP documents, to get ideas of the importance when you're writing your grant. We heard it today, when you're writing your grant in the background section, a Delphi panel of multidisciplinary experts decided that this question was in the top 10 of all questions that pertain to injured patients when they're in the hospital. So I think we can use that hopefully as a powerful setup for the good research that we'll be putting together. But in the end, we got to get funding. We heard from them today. We have to put together these projects. We've now done the work to define what the high priority questions are, and now we have to answer them and get them funded. And I think this is the work we've done over the last 2 days and that we'll do going forward is a great start to that. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions as it relates to NTRAP. I'll give you a pretty San Diego picture to finish up. Questions?
That was a great summary, Todd. Is your paper out yet? I haven't seen it.
It's out.
EPUB?
It's out in an EPUB format just over the last within the last month. So it should be.
Tremendous work on culling all
Todd will post a link to it on Twitter.
Okay, I'll read my.
If Elliot shows me how, yes, I will.
The second question, one of the panels was about critical care. Did that overlap with the VTE stuff? I mean, critical care, treatment of critical care patients is where.
The true answer is I don't know, because I have not seen those results, and I have not seen that paper yet, but I'm sure that it will, and I'm sure Dr. Bulger can comment.
The critical care paper just went in, and there's some overlap, and we knew there would be overlap. And so, one of the, I think, exciting things and why we spent a lot of time doing this taxonomy for every single question across every single panel was so that we can then search across panels. So, and I've already talked with Todd and Elliot about, one of the first secondary manuscripts I think that should come out should be a search across all the panels for VTE, and then we can present, a summary of what was unique in the geriatric panel, what might have been different in the pediatric panel. Maybe it's not a priority in the pediatric panel. That's worth saying, right? So I think that more to come. The critical care paper has been submitted and is under review, so it should be out hopefully soon.
Excellent summary. Between you or Eileen, so where is that housed, and will have access or can request that this search goes across?
So, our goal has been to get the project done. We're in a 1-year no-cost extension that ends in September. So all of the primary manuscripts we want to have out by then. And then we're setting up a strategy to have secondary analyses where somebody could say, I'm interested in this topic, whether it could be rib fractures, could be Reboa, whatever it is, God forbid. But then we can search across the panels and give you that data for a paper. And we'll have a publications committee that will help work with people so that there's not 12 people writing the same paper to try to bring people together. But yes, that's the plan, to make it available through Center. Center would be the contact for it. But we're not quite there yet because we're still finishing up the primary deliverables from the grant.
Other questions? All right, fantastic. So now that concludes the virtual program, and before anybody hops off the virtual program, first of all, I want to again thank you all for joining us both in person and in a virtual fashion. I want to again thank the NIH, NHLBI for supporting this, as well as the American College of Surgeons AAST, and EAST for their generous support. Then the one thing we'll ask you to do two things. The first is Center has an investigator database that we are hoping that all people interested in this, we can email out a QR code. And for those of you in the audience today, they're on your table. Please, if you have not done it already, go in and fill that out. That's a way for you to connect with Center. It's a way for Center to connect you based on your interest with other investigators. For younger investigators, if you're interested in mentorship, it's a great way to get hooked in, and we'd really appreciate that if you join that investigator database.